Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much to Chair and to Mr. Kautoki for their time, for being with us this morning. And I trust everyone is seeing my screen.
Yes.
So,
Yes, go ahead.
what we are looking at today is a really critical area, especially for the CARICOM region. It's not just a simple matter of looking at consumer protection, but it's really looking at how do we protect our consumers in a very fast-paced changing economy. So we hear things like Prime Day and Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and these things now start to have relevance for us here in CARICOM because of certain changes that we are experiencing. We are now part of a bigger dynamic. So we are seeing a change with how we look at our electronic communications infrastructure. We have had investment in our broadband infrastructure, and it means that our people now have a greater internet access. So we have e-commerce and we have m-commerce, the ability to utilize our mobile phones and do everything from just a phone. What we are seeing is that companies are now marketing towards what we call impulse purchase prone shopping days, where they can jump onto consumer behavioral traits. We have a variety. I'll ask everybody to mute their mics while we are presenting so that only the presenter's mic is open. We also have product research and choice options being amplified online. And when we think of how many shoppers there are outside in the world, we have 2.64 billion people worldwide. And because we have skyboxes in the Caribbean, we have ways to go online in the USA and bring things into the Caribbean. When you see a demographic that gives you a US figure for Florida, that could also include the CARICOM figures. At the heart of our behavioral trait, we are seeing a change in how we view things philosophically. So we no longer want to have a record or have a CD or have a book, but we are content to have this flat ownership on a digital means, and it's changing how we look at things. So the question we want to pose to ourselves at the end of today's entire session is, how do we protect consumers in a fast-paced technological environment with rapidly changing consumer behavior? So we're very going to quickly look at what is a consumer in this regard, some critical concerns, some legislative landscape, and some things that we are doing at CCC to help the overall situation. So we know that competition and consumer are really two ends of a spectrum that are looking at ensuring market correction. We have to take consideration that in any relationship between traders and consumers, that there is a power structure and that power structure is asymmetric. So what we have to do is that we have to ensure that when we see commercial practices that can materially distort the interests of consumers, that we can capture it and that we can protect them against it. And it's something called detriment, which looks at harm or loss that results from failed expectations. And at the start of the next segment, we're going to hear a little bit from Rommel on that. The terms consumer and customer are used interchangeably, but in the electronic communications world, in the digital world, it's also expanded to include users. So it is not just the person who spends the money, but the person who actually uses the thing that is bought, the device or the equipment. And how theoretically we have been addressing the issues of consumerism is that we've been defining consumer in the terms of how they deal with information. So we had the courts recognizing that an average consumer is one that is reasonably well informed, reasonably observant, and circumspect. And in a way, it's almost a super consumer because the consumer is supposed to read everything and be so well informed before they make their decision that a lot of attribution is put onto the consumer. A vulnerable consumer then becomes one who can't access that information, either because they have a permanent disability or a temporary circumstance, for example, a hurricane, so they can't access internet to see what terms and conditions apply to them. And in the digital economy, we have a new creature called the disengaged consumer. Basically, they're thinking, it's not worth it to keep researching. So I'll stay with what I have, do with what I have. Why expend the effort to switch to someone else? And it's something called satisficing. And in a way, we have to look at the disengaged consumer almost as a subset of the vulnerable consumer. And the question we can ask ourselves is, at the end of the day, is the digital economy making everybody to some extent a vulnerable consumer? Because there's always going to be a higher level of asymmetry in the structure of the market. And the consumer here in the CARICOM and the CSME is the same as anywhere else in the world. But in looking at remedies and our placement of how much information we give to the consumer, I thought it, a good thing to just quote Micklitz, because his research is really referring to the amount of information we're throwing onto our consumers as information saturation, and for us to look at whether it really enhances the consumer decision-making process. And recently, the courts in Europe acknowledged that you needed to have that balance between a high level of consumer protection and allowing businesses to be competitive. And this one is really good for our purposes today with the digital economy, because the courts held that it was okay for Amazon to have a chat function as an ability for consumers to reach out to the providers and not just have a number and an email, which was the traditional way of getting hold of consumer assistance. So looking at what's been happening, we've been having a bilateral relationship between the trader and the consumer, now being changed into a trilateral. Because what you have is you have an intermediary or that platform economy that's now helping facilitate how things are sold, how things are bought, how things are advertised. You also have the high use of artificial intelligence that is changing the way contracts are established, executed, and even the very way they are marketed by sensing what you want based on your patterns that you display online. So there are a few key consumer concerns for this type of platform-based economy, especially those that are free at source, such as a search engine or an Amazon or an eBay. We know that there's an asymmetrical situation happening with information and how strong you are in your bargaining position. It can lead to exploitative advantages taken of human biases and the fallibility, thereby influencing human behavior. Now, this can lead to unfair trade practices. There's a lack of transparency. You can have steering, and you can have deceptive patterns that's been emerging, so that you're on a website and you click and you click and you click, and you don't know that you've just agreed to them accessing your credit card for a monthly prescription. You have certain digital technologies in use through AI that can actually limit access to vulnerable groups. It can actually limit how well you can enter a transaction because you don't have the digital education or the digital access. You can also have things like racism occurring in that I want to use facial recognition before you access my services. And through that, I can recognize ethnic minorities that I don't want to serve and therefore prohibit them from accessing the service. And then we have the critical issues of data and privacy, security, and ownership. And we have an expert in the area speaking on that, Miss Vashi Maraj, coming down a little later. And we are going to hear quite a little more on what India is doing and Africa is doing in this segment. I wanted to just draw your attention to the fact that AI and algorithms that form a critical part of AI and the platform economy have strong competitive issues that can affect consumers by the mere nature of the fact that this technology allows us to recommend, target, and optimize things in a very dynamic way and predict faster than previously experienced through the human factor. It means that you can have explicit collusion being replaced with tacit coordination. And agreements can be happening at a faster pace than traditional means can provide protections for. That being said, we have key competition concerns that we want to take a look at. We have the fact that the market is now a multi-sided one, which occurred in certain special sectors, but now it is par for the course in the digital economy. It means that we have a very strong network effect, and there are switching costs for the user unless we can have a situation where that can be reduced. We have these platforms now being viewed as gatekeepers. And the thing is, they typically reside outside of regulatory frameworks. They don't have to get a concession or a license to operate within the region because they're not technically an internet service provider or a telecommunications provider. So they are floating over the top of the existing regulatory and competitive framework. They have now become so large. They are such grand economies of scale and scope, and they are gathering so much data. And the business model is predicated on a low or zero cost methodology. So we have key competition and consumer concerns. Now, the thing is that from a consumer official perspective, you know that you have a set consumer journey and consumer experience. There are four main stages. You can choose, you can purchase, you can receive, and then you have the end stage of the delivery. But the thing is that there are certain laws that have to be put in place. And the protection for the consumer should be the same whether they are doing it online, offsite, or if they are doing it on site and offline. So you need to have that certain level of information. There should be a trust and confidence in payments, trust and confidence in how their data is treated. They should be assured that they will have delivery met, clarity of customs duties. Do I have the same redress, warranty, and refund? And most critical, do I have the ability to opt in and opt out? So there are four key things that I see as being relevant for a national or regional policy framework. And that is the protection of the consumer tied with choice, the ability to protect choice through competition, the ability to provide a framework that is operative and sound for data, and ensuring payment through electronic transactions, records, and cybersecurity legislation. Now, for those of us visiting outside of the Caribbean to the conference, I just want to quickly point out that we do have the Caribbean community, which is established under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. But the important thing to note there is that it is a common market. It is a customs union. It is not a full single market as is the EU. So we do have no common community law. There is no legislative competence in the CARICOM. The OECS is a sub-region established by the revised Treaty of Bastille, and it operates within the CARICOM structure, but there is a higher level of integration in the OECS. But still, there is no legislative competence there. So when we talk about regional frameworks, we are saying it's policies that sovereign nations meet and agree to, and then incorporate under their own legislation as a separate act. Now, the protection of the CSM, the consumer, is seen as very critical under the RTC. And under Article 186, the Commission has the role of advocation for the enactment and enforcement of consumer protection laws. The obligations of member states are under Articles 184 and 185. And to assist this general protection element, the Community Secretariat has implemented a correct system that is similar to the EU Rapid Alert system. And it's really a mechanism that's meant to take non-food items and give an alert to the region when something is harmful to the region so that all member states can access it quickly. In 2018, a consumer model bill was passed, and 9 out of 13 member states have specific consumer legislation. But Mark's presentation in our first conference dealt in detail with that. So this presentation is not going to do that. Now, in the CSMA, you find that we have a very fragmented approach to how we protect the consumer. And we do not have a consolidated approach. And perhaps for certain situations, you may not need one. But this sample is just to indicate to you how we approach legislation in the region. So we acknowledge that there is some work to be done on the consumer side so that we can have a consolidation of things relevant to consumers in one bowl. And then you will have different types of consumer issues being addressed under different bowls, such as customs and standards. You will have food and drugs and chemicals. When you come to your public utilities and telecommunications, most of our regional members have specific legislation and authorities to deal with those things. So you're going to find that more likely the consumer has to go to different points of contact for consumer redress. Now, how do we look at the balance of the choice placed by consumers? That we need to have an operative and working competition framework. And Part 8 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas establishes a three-tier system where you have policy being established at the wider community level and enforcement regionally by the CCC of cross-border harm and national enforcement by member states. However, we only have 4 members out of 13 member states with competition legislation. So that is the main task ahead for the CCC. Looking at our situation for electronic transactions, we know that really and truly nothing can happen without a legislative framework in the digital economy for this aspect. And Article 239 of the RTC, when it was passed in 2001, promised to enact a protocol on e-commerce. This has not happened, but what has happened is that we have had projects in the region that helped guide member states into the passage of the relevant legislation. So we do have legislation for electronic transactions that recognizes functional equivalence and so on of electronic documentation and signatures. But where I think we are falling short is on the electronic records side and getting cybercrime and cybersecurity issues legislated. So Vashti will speak a little on that later. Our privacy and data protection, whereas we have legislation, there are certain critical steps that are omitted and certain infrastructure, appointment of information commissions that has not yet happened. Out of the region, we only have 2 member states who have appointed information commissioners. And we also have some member states having interception of communications legislation or similar acts that can also impact the overall implementation of any legislation that seeks to assist in data protection and privacy. So having only 6 out of 15 member states with no data protection law, we need to address that. But most importantly, every time you click online, even if it is for something as simple as research, you are giving something of yourself away. So it is very critical to have a regional and a national outlook on how we deal with data in the region. So we can acknowledge that we have certain imbalances because naturally speaking, even though in the region we carve ourselves up into most developed and less developed member states, out there, outside of the region, we are all seen as small island developing economies. And the thing is that whereas we can say we are better than where we were before, because even though we were lower than the rest of the world, recent reports in 2022 place us a bit higher than the other 2 groups in all indices of the SIDS. We need to understand our consumer in the region and how safe they feel to use the services that we are trying to provide. And PwC Digital Nation Survey in 2022 reviewed the use of government online services. And it stated that 55% were deterred in using these services because of security concerns on how their data would be firstly stored and then shared. And whereas quite a bit, 66 advocated use, 46% accessed government via online channels, but 51 were neutral on government use of the responsibility in using that data. So we acknowledge that we have a fragmented legislative and policy landscape, but we still can score high because this is what we do in the Caribbean. We know how to cram for that exam. So we score high on the e-government development index. And we've got Barbados placed at 62, Trinidad and Tobago at 81, the lowest ranking Belize at 136, Haiti at 180. So we've got it at both ends of the spectrum, the higher and the lower. But we do need, as the Commonwealth stated at the start of this meeting, there's a great need for regional harmonization and in the approach to legislation, how we govern digital commerce at all levels, because we need to avoid firms leveraging regulatory gaps and leveraging that arbitrage for themselves to the detriment of consumers and the market. So from an enforcement perspective, we have to not just look at crafting our major theories of harm, but we have to look clearly and closely at conduct theories of harm so that we can avoid inconsistencies in having multiple investigations happening, consumer, competition, telecommunications authority, rather than having something that's joined that identifies what is the source of the harm and then apply the specific and correct tool to the harm. So collaboration amongst competent authorities is critical. Now, my final slide is just giving you a little update on how important the CCC sees the new and emerging trends. Part of our work program this year, and we are almost complete, is a Commonwealth Secretariat funded consultancy that looks at the study of data protection and privacy impact in the regulation of competition and consumer protection for digital markets. And this study is really to help us identify gaps in the current legislative framework that will create enforcement gaps for us so that we can try to see how we can advise COTED and our member states to correct same. To enable the region to really better face the fast-paced changing environment that it's in, we have entered into cooperations with COFICE in Mexico and with COMESA in Africa, a speaker representing COMESA you will hear today. And we have also internally entered into cooperation with CXC so that we can get into the syllabus of our primary schools and secondary schools to educate them on these critical issues. And we are in the process of finalizing cooperation with OCA, which is the regional body for utility commissions, and CTU, which is the regional body responsible for steering regional electronic communications policy. So we have been working for our consumer and our competition and a consumer protection side, and we look forward to today's meeting, helping us in the region understand where we are going and what we have to do, and also sharing this knowledge with all those who have joined on. So thank you very much, Mr. Headley, and thank you, team.